There we go. All right. Hello, Dan.
Hi.
Hello. So could you start off by just telling me why you joined Climate Cultures?
Wow. I can't remember when I joined Climate Cultures. And so I don't remember the moment that led up to it. And so I'd be slightly disingenuous probably to give you a really detailed answer to why I joined at the time. The honest answer is probably, I don't know why I joined at the time, but I guess it will have been, God, this is a terrible answer, isn't it? Are you editing this?
I can, yeah.
Really roundabout way of saying, I don't remember. But and then I think about it and I think, well, obviously why I joined Climate Cultures is because I work in the culture sector and I'm concerned about climate change. And I guess my work over the last couple of years has been a little bit less directly involved in climate change and climate activism for one reason or another. But it's something that I keep returning to. And one of the questions that always drives that is what is a useful contribution to the conversation about climate change that can be made by work like mine? What's a useful way of moving the conversation on or pushing a new thought or idea into that conversation that might not already be part of it? And one way of one of the things that Climate Cultures brings is a sense of all of the other ways that a lot of brilliant, thoughtful, articulate and imaginative people are also attempting to contribute to that conversation with a huge range of different artistic forms and styles, and also, I guess, different dialectical approaches. So some people, you know, that there's a shared anger throughout a lot of the group. And one of the things I find really interesting is how that anger articulates itself. Some people just want to yell at the audience or the reader, and I get that. And some people want to be sort of gently persuasive or funny or surprising, and all of these different things are a sort of fascinating meeting place between the dialectical impulses of the individual artist and who that artist imagines is in that audience. And that kind of imagined audience, I think, is a crucial part of it for me. And one of the things I really enjoy about following work that comes from other members of Climate Cultures is sometimes I'll see it and I think, oh yeah, you're imagining this group of people is going to come, and they're likely to, and you have these assumptions about this group of people. I don't mean that could sound like I'm being a little critical of that. I think we have to make some imaginative leap like that about who's coming and what they bring with them, whether or not we do so consciously. We still do that, and thinking about that process is a huge part of how I work, because the presence of a live audience is fundamental to my work. Okay.
And where would you place yourself in that kind of, I want to yell at the audience, or I want to be gently persuasive, or whatever is in between? Where would you put yourself?
Well, I think one of the reasons that fascinates me is that I vacillate on that. I do want to yell at people. I really do want to yell at people. You idiots! What are you doing? What are you thinking? And I want to assume that the audience already knows all of this, and also, and you know, that the audience is articulate and thoughtful and intelligent and well informed, but also that they might not know this one thing that might really change everything, and also that they don't like being shouted at. And so, and so I don't come down in any individual place. And and I think the audience is never a mass of people. There's always a range, and particularly if you work with live performance, as I do, the audience is a range of very different people with different knowledges and understandings, and that come from different politics, and so I want to try and talk to everyone, but
Hmm.
that is a fantasy.
Yeah.
You have to have a starting point to bring a group of people together in a room.
Uh-huh. And what's usually your starting point?
Hello.
It's a good one. It's good.
I mean, I suppose I will try and imagine that an audience, the group of people who've come, they want to have a good time.
Okay.
They want to be surprised, both in terms of what we might call story, but also in terms of ways of looking at the world.
Okay.
And I suppose my starting point is very often who I was at the beginning of the process of working on the project.
Okay.
So anything that I found out in the last, if I've been working on something for a year, things that I've found out in the last year in the process of deep research into a project, rather than because it popped up on the New York Times website or something that's relatively common knowledge. Yep. Anything that I've found out in the last year, I'll take a punt that that's news.
Okay.
And when I'm watching performance, or when I'm reading literature or looking at visual art, I think news is something that I want. I want to learn something about the world. And by that, I don't necessarily mean that I learn how melting tundra releases methane and what that means in terms of the feedback effect, although I'm interested in that too. And I believe that mass audiences can be interested in that as well, if it's framed in the right way. But also by news, I mean, oh yeah, I do behave like that in the world and I hadn't realized. Or, oh yeah, this set of choices that we are all making every minute of every day has this colossal impact. And therefore, if I make those choices differently, that can also have a colossal impact. Oh yeah, I am part of the process of history and therefore I can change it. All of that can be news to an individual audience member if it's framed through narrative or through humor or through a surprising, arresting set of images.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And when did you start your kind of journey into doing things that were more about climate change or more about the environment?
I think so. I first started making the kind of work that I make now, which is I tend to get classified as a theatre maker, which means I write and perform my own work. And sometimes there are other people in that work. Sometimes it's just me. Sometimes I'm not in it and I direct it. But it's got a family relationship both with devising theatre and with script-based theatre. I don't really think we could spend hours trying to do a kind of genealogy or an archaeology of how these definitions relate to one another. We probably wouldn't really get anywhere. But anyway, the way that I work now is approximately the way I've been working for about the last 10 years. Before that, I was working principally as a director, as a freelance director of plays, with relatively little say in what the work was about. I could select projects on certain bases, but I wasn't commissioning work. I wasn't really initiating work. So I tended to find myself working on projects that had political intent. I guess I just talked to the other artists involved in a persuasive way that tended to get me into the room for those kinds of projects. But I can't think of a single thing that was specifically about climate change in that period, although I was involved in some climate change activism, and I was involved in politics in various ways before that period. So I suppose the first piece of creative work that I made would have been I started work on it in about 2012, and it came to the stage in 2013. It was a project called How to Occupy an Oil Rig, which was a how-to demonstration for how to protest, a demonstration of how to demonstrate.
Yes.
And that was on at the Edinburgh Fringe, and then it went on a UK tour, reasonably extensive UK tour. And although I guess the forms of demonstration that it presented would lend themselves, I've certainly been on anti-capitalist demonstrations that were that used exactly the same forms, but this was specifically geared around climate activism.
Okay.
And although that's probably the piece of work that I've made that has been most explicitly, directly, and principally about climate change. Climate change has been part of pretty much every project I've made since then. It's been part of the conversation, not just about what's in the work. So it might not be the primary topic, but it's part of the world, an unavoidable and urgent part of the world, in which we're also having a conversation about virology, funnily enough.
Right.
Sure, or I made a show about borders and immigration a couple of years ago called Instructions for Border Crossing. And again, climate change was a presence in that, although it wasn't kind of above the title, if you like. So it's been part of the work I've been making ever since then. And it's been a big part of some collaborative work that I've been involved in over the last couple of years as well. Last year, I worked with an artist, the year before, in fact, 2019, I worked with an artist called Aidan Mosby, who's a visual artist by training, but he was making his first performance piece. So I collaborated with him to help him create that. And absolutely all of his work is climate change themed, one way or another. And we are now working towards another collaboration, which will hopefully happen towards the end of this year. Although predictions are mug's game at the moment. Who knows when that will happen. But I've got a couple of other projects that are in varying degrees of pipeline for this year and next that again have climate change quite close to their center.
Okay. What I'm really interested in when you toured how to board an oil rig?
How to occupy an oil rig.
Occupy an oil rig. Who came to see it and what happened to them when they saw it? Did they change? Did they enjoy it? Did they hate it?
I think that the title was a problem with hindsight.
Okay.
I think the title was really good fun. The same is true of Instructions for Border Crossing. I think I made the same mistake 4 years later. And about both shows, actually, I had the same conversation with the same friend who's much more deeply involved in climate activism than I am. He was really excited about these things kind of meeting a broad audience and being really accessible to a popular theatre audience that could really enjoy this, but that were being taken on a journey to some radical politics, some radical views of both what was necessary and also what was possible. And I realized again, just because I was attracted to these things as titles and the sort of thing that I would go and see. But I think that if you're someone who thinks, one of the things that made both of these shows successful for the people who came was that they reeled people in. They didn't start by hectoring. They didn't start by yelling at the audience, although there was space for some yelling in there, not necessarily at the audience, but at the system or systems.
Okay.
But audiences were, I guess, taken on a journey towards the place where that yelling was necessary. And it took people to that place from wherever they started. Not everyone will have got on board with that, of course. And certainly some people hated each of those shows, unquestionably. But they were both, they both met with a lot of success, both in terms of just in the moment and on the evening response, and other, you know, things like award nominations or good reviews, that sort of thing. I don't know that good reviews tell you anything about what audiences actually think or how they behave. But, you know, I'll say those things anyway. But yeah, I do think that they would have been more successful as activism if they'd disguised their activist intent at the level of the title, at least. Then I think that more people who weren't already leaning that way would have come. And I think that then more people would have bristled a bit. But I also think that more, so I think it would be a bit rich to claim that in 75 minutes of theatre, like, minds were profoundly changed. I think that very rarely happens, but small differences can be made. I often think of, you know, those 2p machines that you get in arcades by the seaside, you know, the thing where you put in 2p and it sort of falls down a series of slots and there's lots of 2p's going backwards and forwards. And what you want is for a huge number of them to come crashing down. And that very rarely happens, but you don't know. I think of conversation and art as a part of the wider conversation as being another 2p in that machine. And sometimes you might, in an hour and a quarter, you might get to shove a few 2p's down there, and you never know which is going to be the 2p piece that's going to bring the whole thing crashing down for even one or a few audience members. People who go looking to art for kind of profound, dramatic moments of lives changed. That's an aspiration, and we should absolutely aim for that. But we can't be discouraged by the fact that realistically, that doesn't happen very often. How many stories do you have about that happening in response to a piece of art? Most people have one or two in a whole lifetime. So if you make a piece of theatre and people have a really good time, and you tour it to 50 or 70 venues, and that happens for one or two people, that's actually pretty remarkable. Also, adding another 2p to that conversation and being a part of the wider dialogue while not alienating people, while bringing people along, while moving, while broadening the Overton window of possible conversations about these subjects. And I come from a reasonably radical politics, but I want to talk to people who don't necessarily automatically share those politics. And I'm not saying if you don't share those politics, you won't like the show. And I'm not saying if you get to the end of the show and don't share those politics, I've failed. I think that's a bit ludicrous. But if I've broadened the window of possible opinions for everyone in the room, and I've contributed to that conversation such that at some point someone else's 2p is going to be the thing that causes it to crash down, then I've done my job.
I think that's a really great way of looking at it, actually, because I think a lot of the time we put a lot of pressure on one thing, like one policy, one document, one piece of art to change, you know, millions of people's minds. And like you said, that's not how it works. And I also really like that idea of it's a lot of little things, because that is how things change. It's a lot of little things that then add up to that, or the 2p's crashing down.
And as artists, we'll tend to inflate the importance of an individual piece of artwork, because I'll spend a whole year working on something. Might not be the only thing I do in a year, but I'll spend a year or more working on something that's then going to be an hour of someone else's life. And they're aware of it in advance. They hear a few things about it. They read about it on Twitter. They might see a review. They think about it afterwards. So it's got a kind of half-life, if you like. that half-life will be shorter or longer depending on the extent of the impact, or just the extent to which they've had a worthwhile experience in that room for an hour and a quarter or 90 minutes or whatever. But I'm kidding myself if I think that it's as big a part of everyone else's life as it's been for me. That's just it's just that the grotesque narcissism that would be involved in thinking that doesn't think about.
Well, yeah. But we do that a lot.
Yeah, but to some degree we have to. Like, we have to think that it is worth spending a year of our lives making this thing.
Right.
And we sort of have to keep both of those things in play. We have to think that it might change the world profoundly for everyone who wants to see it. We have to think that it might, but we also have to be, once we've got it out in the world, we have to be content with the fact that we continue to live in reality. And, and you know, it's taken a while to move the conversation on climate change as far as it's now moved, and it is urgent. We have to keep believing that the next thing is going to be the thing. But if it almost inevitably then isn't, we can't give up. And if we put too much pressure on it to be the thing that does change everything, it's like that doesn't keep us in it for the long haul.
Yeah, I think it's really key. Like, a lot of what you're saying is actually it's quite inspirational to like keep going, keep making this, you know, because it's very easy to go, oh, like you say, that one thing, that 2p didn't work. Well, I'll just leave. I'll leave the arcade. I'm not doing this anymore. And
actually, that is a good strategy with the 2p.
Yes, if you don't want to get
always win
to gambling.
I'm going to maintain my belief that when it comes to capitalism fueled climate crisis, I have to maintain my belief that the house doesn't always win, or that we are the house. I think this analogy is in danger of stretching to breaking point. I might leave that one there.
Yeah, brilliant. So that brings us to what you're working on at the moment. Virtual rehearsal rooms have been mentioned.
Well, the virtual rehearsal room that I'm in isn't my rehearsal room, actually. I'm working as a kind of mentor, a supporting artist for a younger artist called Holly Gallagher, who's working on a couple of different projects. So this week she's working towards making a piece for family audiences, actually. So I've been working with her and a couple of other people via Zoom on that. Last year I was scheduled to be going out on an extensive tour with a new show called These Hills Are Ours, which we then obviously didn't do. That moved to the autumn. It then moved to the spring and was due to be going out at the end of this month. That's obviously not going to happen, but we will get that show out at some point. And that show is that show's kind of about the relationship between urban and rural. And again, it's not, I'm not sure that climate change is mentioned in it, but again, it's the ghost at the feast. It's this relationship between modern digital capitalist culture and rural space and wilderness, insofar as we have any actual wilderness in this country. It's a show about, so I'm working with a singer-songwriter called Boff Worley, who you won't know him, but you will know the band he was in for 30 years, Chumbawamba. So he's got one really famous song in a 30-year career.
But he's still going. That's the most important thing.
Yeah. He got knocked down, but he got up again.
Exactly.
Yeah, you know, and he can't complain about that being the only famous song, because that's why he owns his house.
Right. Yep.
So we've been working together on this show. as part of the process of making which, we ran a series of routes from the centre of the town or city in which we found ourselves to the top of the peak overlooking that city. So it's kind of a meditation on our place in the environment and our relationship with nature, and what that relationship is when so many of us are coming from a highly urban, highly digital, fume-filled, rapid environment, to then find ourselves on top of a mountain peak looking back at where we've come from, brings with it a whole series of meanings. So this show, it really tells the story of several of those journeys, and one in particular that was a bit of an epic, that was in March, beginning of March last year, so shortly before the show was supposed to go out.
Yeah.
So it'll be a full year. It'll be a bit more of a distant memory, that adventure, by the time the show finally goes out. But yes, so that's something that I'll be in Zoom rehearsals for over the next couple of weeks, as well as we work towards. So as things stand, we may have some shows we've got shows booked in February, March, April, May, June. I'm pretty sure that something, I don't know when, but at the moment, the first show that it's legal for us to do is at the end of February. I think it's unlikely that that'll go ahead. I don't think it should go ahead, probably. But we might get to April and find that it does go out. So that show is going to be on the road at some point this year. And I'm also working on an outdoor project, which is so early in inception that it doesn't yet have a title, but it's a relatively small thing, and that'll see the light of day this summer. And it's the kind of playable experience, and it is a kind of a playable adventure taking place over a wide swathe of land, where a group of people play a game according to a series of rules that's based very loosely on kind of fox and hounds or manhunting type games that were very popular in wide open spaces, particularly in the Victorian period, and more recently if you were in the Boy Scouts. But we're trying to kind of retool these games to think about behavior in resource depleted circumstances, and to give players, participants, audience members, however you want to think of them, an embodied experience of what a post climate apocalypse / 2031 world might feel like. And then that'll be turned into a short film in some form that will both be a document of the experience of playing it, but also an invitation to set up your own game like it.
Okay. That's really interesting. I've been doing recently some reading around games and like what games give us. And they are really, as well as being fun, they're a really great tool to experiment with things. And like, people like playing games because it gives us, the good work to do, and it gives us rewards, and it gets us working together depending on the type of game. So I think that's really interesting, to mix games and art and environmentalism. That's going to be
I think it's really fruitful. I also think I think about things that I've seen even in theatre spaces that have some kind of game element, whether or not the audience participates in those game elements, or whether it's something that's played out between the figures on stage.
Right.
You talk to people afterwards about what they remember, and it's always the game type elements, because they are real. There's something absolutely unfakeable about some of those things, and the tang of immediacy and liveness of something really happening in the room with us is exciting. Even if it's a stupid game, it's exciting. And if used unwisely, I remember once seeing a play that had two people constructing a domino rally as part of it. And I found it impossible to listen to what they were saying.
Right, right. Yeah. Absorbed by the dominoes.
Yeah, yeah. There's something about the fact that that whole thing could just collapse at any moment, that completely dominated to the point of overpowering the material of the play.
Yeah.
And the playwright had done, I think, some brilliant and interesting work in terms of putting that to work as a metaphor.
Mm-hmm.
But I can't remember who the playwright was, or even what the play was. I can't really remember anything about it, apart from two figures on stage arranging a domino rally, because
Right.
it took over.
Right.
But whoever that playwright was, it's probably like someone I know now who like, damn you, bye. But that metaphor couldn't be contained by that fictional universe. It just took over.
Right. So that leads me on nicely to something else I want to ask you, which is, do you have a favorite eco artwork or project or event or anything in that sphere? Anything that sticks in your mind like the dominoes, or has inspired you in some way?
Oh, that's such a difficult question. You sent me these questions in advance as well, didn't you? Or did you?
I can't remember if I did.
If you did, I should particularly have thought about this one. It's funny, I'm thinking about things again that didn't necessarily have climate activism right at their center, but that carried something of climate activism with them all the same.
They are valid.
Yeah, so for some reason, the thing that's, and this is often, I guess this is just the thing that pops to mind whenever people ask about something that had a profound impact. There was a show made by National Theatre of Wales in Port Talbot, probably about 10 years ago, actually, maybe a little less than 10 years ago, called The Passion. It took over the whole town of Port Talbot. It had Michael Sheen as a sort of Jesus figure, contemporary Jesus figure in contemporary Port Talbot.
Okay.
And it had a participatory performance company of hundreds. The whole town of Port Talbot was the scene of this show over the course of a whole weekend, and some bits were ticketed. Like there was the Last Supper took place in a working men's club, and it was only like 250 people who could be present. The Manic Street Preachers played as part of that. But there were thousands of people present for the final sequence, for the crucifixion sequence. Okay. And it framed Jesus as a revolutionary. And I'm not a Christian, but I do believe that a historical man called Jesus was a revolutionary.
Right.
And that he said some things that are worth listening to as part of that process. And he was a revolutionary against an occupying imperial power. And it really went with that. And the Romans were these, I'm afraid I can't remember how they were framed exactly, but they were this very sinister CCTV everywhere set of security forces protecting capitalist political interests. And thinking about the way Port Talbot is sited, it nestled in the valley, and with the landscape of these hills as part of its backdrop, and some of the debates that were real and often live debates about how the town had been and has been overlooked as part of wider political conversations, that I struggle to point to a specific moment that was about how climate change is part of this conversation, but it was always part of the conversation, such that it didn't need a specific moment to help you realize that these they were called ICU. I can't remember what it stood for, but there's an obvious pun in that. These kind of sinister security forces were quite clearly, among their many other things, they were the drivers of man-made climate change. And Jesus, or Michael Sheen's Jesus figure, I'm not even sure if he was ever named as Jesus, He was, among other things, a climate activist, and rather than having 40 days in the desert, he was up in the hills sleeping wild. And the connection between him and his views and his activism and the natural world and the world that was in retreat in the face of what he contrasted with, these militarized forces of kind of capitalist spectacle producing, not spectacles as in glasses, but as in the situationists. That contrast was so obviously and permanently present that kind of didn't need them to declare that one of the things that was an issue in this debate between community and power was the environmental destruction.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that's the better way to do it? That it's like it subtly runs through the whole storyline, but it's not declared, as you say.
I think there has to be both. I mean, I think that's where my instincts lie. I think that's what I try to do. Which I guess is a way of answering that earlier question. But if there's a piece of work that is explicitly themed around climate change, as I said earlier, I think that's probably going to rarefy the audience that comes, and it might mean that a lot of the people who come already are to some degree on board. But I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's this criticism that gets leveled an awful lot, particularly around political theatre, but I think about political art more widely, that it's preaching to the choir.
Right.
I hate that as a criticism, because, well, they don't have a problem with that in churches, do they?
Right.
And they've been going a while. Well, the mistake I think the critique of the idea of preaching to the choir makes is an assumption that you're only there to convert people. But church is not, the choir is not there to be converted. Church is about galvanizing the faithful. Evangelism happens outside of church. So if you've got a room full of people who are already believers, it doesn't mean they needn't have come. Otherwise, there'd never be another political meeting again. There'd never be a rally. There'd never be a march. Galvanizing the faithful is an important function of religious experience. And by the same measure, if you've got a room full of people at a theatrical event, and everyone in the room already believes that man-made climate change is real, which it is. So, like, I don't think it would be that would be great to have that many people in the room who thought that. And it doesn't mean that you then are wasting your time, because everyone in that room still brings different views about the right way forward, and different views about and different information. So gathering people who broadly share a set of views, even though, as I say, this isn't how I think about myself as talking to audiences generally. I still want to be in those audiences. And actually, probably the work that I often enjoy most is far more kind of scabrous and direct and abrasive, probably, than my own work is. And that's purely a matter of individual tastes and impulses, and also it's about what I find that I can do well. That's how I find myself to be most useful. But it would be really tedious if everyone had the same set of instincts as me, wouldn't it? Like, just because I make work in a particular way, it would be a mistake to construe that as a demand that everyone else make the same kind of work. Well, then I'd be out of a job.
Yeah. Right. And that is the wondrous thing about art, is that, like you say, with the Climate Cultures members, there's such a breadth of different disciplines and different voices.
And actually, one of the places it did come from for me, to loop back to your first question, is that there were a series of tipping point conferences and events.
Right.
And I came to climate cultures more or less directly via those conferences and events, of which I was at, I probably was only at maybe 3 or 4 of them, but I got a huge amount out of being present at those. And that's absolutely, you know, everyone there already had a basic set of principles in agreement with one another, didn't they? But I found those enormously galvanizing as an artist and as an activist and just as a human. So that kind of gathering of the tribe, you know, gathering of people who have some starting points in common. I do think that climate cultures wouldn't exist at all without that sense of us having gathered at some point, at least.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's see if we can continue that. If only remotely.